our theme today is BRICS. And you know that the joke about BRICS used to be that it was the only international organization invented by a merchant bank. Because the whole idea came up when Jim O'Neill of, was it Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, wrote an essay in the 90s saying the four major emerging economies of the world that the West would have to reckon with were Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So that was where the acronym BRIC was created. Mr. Putin thought that was a great idea. He proposed that the four of them meet in a forum that people started calling BRICS because there were four countries, but the original idea was BRIC. And then the South Africans said, well, you have an S now, everyone is saying BRICS, so why not add us? And after 5 or 6 years of BRIC being just the four of them, South Africa got added and they became 5. And this became an engine for South-South cooperation, an organization that was meant to promote a different view of the world. Since then, last year, there's been a further expansion as 5 more countries have joined BRICS. This was a somewhat contested idea. The Chinese pushed very strongly for an expansion. India was extremely hesitant to begin with, but finally went along when the identity of the 5 was mutually agreed. And the 5 are Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Indonesia. So you've got a number of countries in that mix who share India's view that you can be non-West without being anti-West. And that, I think, is what specifically distinguishes the Indian point of view from, say, the Chinese or the Russian point of view on BRICS. Now, all very well, you might say, why are we talking about BRICS today? Well, just a few days ago, Mr. Trump, the new sort of earth-shaking president of the United States, issued one of his typically unpredictable broadsides where he threatened a 100% tariff on BRICS countries if they dared to contemplate an alternative currency. Now, the strange thing is that there was no serious discussion in BRICS about an alternative currency. Yes, the Chinese and Russians are keen on one. And the reason is principally the Russians have been sanctioned by the US, so the ruble has a problem and cannot trade in dollars. The Chinese, of course, have very much a perception that the US are hostile to them. But no other country has been pushing for any sort of alternative currency. And the Indian Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, immediately said, we certainly don't want an alternate currency. We are only interested in continuing with the dollar, but we will have bilateral trade relationships in our normal currencies. So you can have rupee-ruble trade with Russia or rupee-real trade with Iran and so on. Now that is a different proposition from actually having an alternative BRICS currency. Anyway, I think the hubbub over that has not fully died down, but it should do. Nonetheless, we have with us somebody who has run a think tank in Hong Kong. I'm also someone who's written a few pieces in the world media over the last 10 years as BRICS has evolved. I've also led the Indian delegation to the BRICS Parliamentary Forum in Moscow 10 years ago. I've participated in BRICS civil society initiatives when India was the host. So I've got some sense of how BRICS is working. And Chandran Nair, who has a think tank and is also in global business himself, he has his own views. So let's turn to him first and see how he sees the future of BRICS in this newly turbulent world.
I would like to start by painting the picture of the world we live in which BRICS sits as an alliance of nations, some of the most powerful, seeking, as you say, not an anti-Western, but perhaps a non-Western framing of where the 21st century is going. And my understanding of this session was also to have a discussion around actually a post-Western world, which I have written a fair bit about. And so to complement what Shashi just said, I will try and frame, having had a front seat to developments, particularly in China for the last 30 years, which I know is a sensitive topic in India, but I might say a few nice things about China, so please don't get annoyed. but I also come from Southeast Asia and what's happening there. I'm a Malayali, but I'm one of those outcasts born in Malaysia, sorry. So I will try and give that framing of why all of these things are happening in the larger context. And just now, several people spoke to me about it's really important for us in India, as that person said, to understand that context. And in my view, as Shashi very importantly said, whenever people like us talk about what we see as the Western hegemony, etc., we're all quite often risk being labeled anti-Western. And I am at pains to point out, both to Westerners and the others who are pro-Western, that it's not anti-Western, it's a non-Western view. And that non-Western view is emerging because, as we all know, we are now into that period where the colonization period ended about 70 years ago. And many of us thought that that colonization period would immediately result in sort of emancipation in terms of the development models, etc., but it took a long time. So one of the things that I have written about is that we are going through probably the most difficult period in many senses because of population peaking, the existential threats, but also where the decolonization period has taken us. And so I'll just name 5 things that I think we have to understand and then put in context everything Shashi has also talked about. And the tensions we are facing today I name as 5. The first one is the understanding amongst the majority world. Actually, the non-Western world is 85% of the world. Some of us may not fully appreciate, given the power of the Western media, that what is happening today is the rest of the world, it took 70 years sometimes to rewrite history. So the West has to contend with a rewriting of his story. That's why it's called his story. It's not our story or my story. And that is very painful. And it took a man like him to write that wonderful book, Inglorious Empire. But it took an Indian with the international stature to put a book out that showcased this. And I think Oxfam have a new publication out as well. So the rewriting is very important because now we are beginning to understand. But that rewriting shouldn't create resentments and negative sentiments because that's unproductive. So that's the first one that's happening. The second is the understanding that the much spoken about rules-based world order is a sham. So what's happening in Gaza is probably the best example of a sham. So there was no such thing, but it is of course the mystical thing that we all bought into. The third one is that and this is where the dollarization issue comes in, that there was apparently that there is only one global financial architectural system, whether it's the dollar, but it's a whole system which can only be maintained as it is. And whether you talk about de-dollarization, but all the gatekeepers of the global financial architecture are Western institutions. But both the standardization, the rating agencies, all of that are Western, the gatekeepers. And I speak about that in my book as well. So that's the third. The fourth is the idea that the West is the peacekeepers of the world. So if we have a little diplomatic spat in Southeast Asia between Cambodia and Thailand, my God, a Norwegian turns up to help us make peace because apparently we can't talk to each other. If there's a spat between the Koreans, we need Scandinavians and Canadians to come and speak. We can't have Indians, Indonesians to go and do this. So that whole idea that the West are the gatekeepers of peace, the reasonable diplomats, is also a scam and a sham. And lastly, the idea that there is a world media where the gold standard is essentially the New York Times or the Financial Times is another lie. So we need to understand that. I'm not saying that all of them are bad, but we are captive as subjects of the colonies to this. I was a captive as well. To some degree, I'm still a captive, but I've tried to free myself. But writing all of this is to understand those 4 or 5 realms where we have to free ourselves. So the mental capture is very important. So I'll finish and hand over by saying, we can go back and talk about all the reparations and all of that, but that's really not my interest anymore. My real interest is in the post-Western world, and whether you call it BRICS or double I with Indonesia in the middle, which is large. The question is, what are we going to do, the large countries of the world, the 85% of the population, in terms of dealing with how we run our countries, how do we deal with the existential threats that we are faced with? The existential threats that humanity faces are exceptional at this point, and I won't go into all the details. How do we deal with this? But expecting the United States or the UK to come to our rescue is living in the past. So what do we do? And therein lies the issue of how do we govern? What does our political economy look like? And therefore, how do we essentially even talk about rights and freedoms? And that's why I would like to share some of my experience of what I've seen with the Chinese experience. I'm not saying it's exportable, what works, what I'm seeing in Southeast Asia, but looking backwards is important to understand where we are. But the thing is, where do we go forward at a time where the world's population is 8, and there'll be more Indians than anybody else on the planet, in a country that will have the largest population, but is 1/3 the size of the next largest, which is China. And therein lies the challenge of what I think the post-Western world's political philosophy should be. So I'll stop there and then let the great man answer.
Let me comment on some of the things you've said and then offer an additional thought of my own. You made 5 points. The first was history. I agree, but I would stress that history is always contested terrain. That people, I mean, you know the famous old story about that until the lion finds his voice, the tale of the hunt will always be that of the hunter. So history is written by the winner. And therefore, the history that we got about the colonial period was essentially from the colonist point of view. And it took us a while to find our voice and challenge that narrative. Equally, in domestic context, there is a contestation over history right now. In North India, there's this entire battle going on about, for example, Mughal history and where that fits in to our country. So we're looking at some very, very interested battles, and I think they will always be there. Some will prevail at some time, some will be in the backseat at another time. But as long as we are able to express a different point of view from the prevailing dogma, history remains a fair battleground for us to pursue our beliefs and values. Your second point was about the rule-based world order, and I couldn't agree more, though I wouldn't have put it quite that bluntly, but you're right, because after all, when you have Mr. Trump blithely wanting to take over Greenland, and when you want him to when he's telling Canada, telling the Prime Minister of Canada, you should come and be our 51st state. It's a bizarre situation because in the entire post-World War II, liberal international sort of rules-based world order, the first building block was supposed to be state sovereignty. Everyone even at least had to pay lip service to state sovereignty, even as if a state was incapable of asserting its sovereignty, or if the country paying lip service was busy undermining that sovereignty. After all, why, when Iraq tried to take over Kuwait, did the entire world rally around Kuwait and attack Iraq and authorize the invasion of Iraq? It was simply because, very simply, the one principle that every state felt protected them was the principle of sovereignty. So if Kuwait's sovereignty could be suddenly changed overnight, tomorrow all of us are vulnerable. And so the entire world united against that particular move by Iraq. Today, is the entire world uniting against Mr. Trump? It may come to that, but certainly Chandran Nair is right in pointing out that some of these assumptions are no longer sacred if the country that claimed credit for creating and upholding this world order has a president who's himself undermining its most fundamental precept. That was your second point. On your third point about the international financial architecture. Once again, it's difficult to disagree because of one major fact, that the institutions created to run the world economy, the Bretton Woods institutions created in 1944 as World War II was ending, continue to be completely dominated by the West. That is, the president of the World Bank is always an American named by the American government. Even if today he happens to be a turban-wearing Sikh, he's an American citizen. And the president, the head of the IMF managing director is the title, is always a European named by the European Union. And this is a mutual agreement between the big Western countries. The caveat or the slight comment of change is, number one, there has been a slight and gradual shift in power within these organizations. That is, that if you look at the fact that as late as about 2008 or 2009, the voting strength of China in the World Bank and the IMF was exactly the same as the voting strength of Belgium, which seems laughable. Today, that is no longer true. Some more shift has happened, not enough in the views of many people, because the original agreement in 2008 in Pittsburgh was that the entire world would be divided into two equal voting blocks, as it were, the West or the developed economies in one half, and the emerging markets and transition economies, as they were called, in the other half. But that hasn't happened. The other half still hasn't got 50%. But there are slowly, I think, some moves in that direction. And the other caveat worth mentioning is that when we had the sanctions against Russia for the last 2.5 years, if you read the newspapers and the analyses of 2022, everyone was predicting the collapse of the Russian economy, the complete plummeting down of the ruble, massive inflation, scarcity of goods, long queues outside the shops. None of this has happened. The Russians cannot trade in dollars, but amazingly enough, the ruble has actually strengthened during the war. And they have found in China an economic partner willing to help them overcome the disabilities of sanctions. So is the Western-dominated dollar economy as all-powerful as your comment implied? I would question that. I would say if Russia and China can challenge it, perhaps so can collectively others if the need should arise. What were your two other points? I'm trying to recall now because you've raised 5 of them. Media and peacekeeping. On peace, there again, I would tend to be more in agreement than in disagreement. He is right that peacemaking is often the monopoly of Western powers, and the reason is that they were the ones always assumed to have greater stake in the outcome. That is, the rich countries, who are also the biggest weapons-producing countries, they often had more to do to fuel a war and support one or the other of the factions, and they also had most to gain from ending the war and maintaining a peace in the interests of their world order. So that's why he's right. Even when the United Nations did peacekeeping, or peacemaking, I beg your pardon, peacekeeping, everyone was involved, but peacemaking, then it was almost always a national of a Western country who came with the UN hat on and made peace between warring factions. So to that degree, he's right. But it is not impossible to stand up against this. India, for example, had accepted an American as the UN peacemaker between us and Pakistan and Kashmir in 1948. And there had been the UN military observer group on our border. But after the 71 war, India insisted that we would no longer accept any role for the UN or any role for any international mediation. They said, we can talk to each other, the Pakistanis and us can talk to each other. We do not welcome any interference from anyone else. And today, if you ask the UN Secretary General, don't you think you should go and make peace between India and Pakistan? He will give you a different line. He will say something like, well, if two countries want to make peace with each other and they need our help, we're always available. No one is going to try and impose themselves when a country like India refuses. And I think that is also an important development that we should note. And finally, on the world media, there again, I'm afraid he is right. Not only the mainstream or legacy media he mentioned, like the Western news agencies, the major Western mastheads like the New York Times and the the Washington Post in America, or Le Monde in the French language, a Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung in German. All of these, in their respective language domains, command an outsized influence, as do AP, UNI, Reuters. I'm sorry, not UNI, I beg your pardon. UNI is Indian. UPI, United Press International, and Reuters. All these are headquartered in either London or New York, and they are the ones who dominate. Now, to add to that, there was Bloomberg, which became the major source of financial news, also Western-led, though it has a big presence in Asia, in Hong Kong. So ultimately, where does hope come? If you look at politics, I remember the time that when the BJP felt they weren't getting a fair shake in Indian media, they turned to social media. And that became their alternative way of raising their image and doing their messaging. Today, we in the opposition need to do the same thing because we feel we're not getting a fair shake in the mainstream media within India. But at the global level, social media itself is a Western creation and becomes a part of aiding and abetting the same problem that Chandran Nair analyzed. So the question is, he's right, but what does that mean? And one of my concerns, I mentioned at the very beginning of my first remarks, that India believes we can be non-West without being anti-West. And I think that's very important because there is a danger that with BRICS, the Chinese and post-Ukraine, the Russians, might see BRICS as a forum through which they can create a sort of resistance to the Western world order. And that resistance inevitably will be to serve the political interests of China as an alternative hegemon to the United States. And from an Indian's point of view, especially given how China has behaved towards us for some time now, in the last few years particularly, my own concern is a Chinese-dominated world order is no better for us than an American-dominated world order. So we need to navigate between the two, and that's why we're trying to have a foot in both camps. We are part of the community of democracies when President Biden convened such a gathering, and at the same time we are active in BRICS. We can't afford to slip out of BRICS because then it really could become a hostile platform. But while we are in BRICS, one of our main roles will be to moderate its geopolitical stance. And we will have questions and answers of the audience, so we'll have a chance to hear your views on that. But I want to leave you with that in thought and get your comments because you've written an entire book about dismantling the Western privileges and talking about a post-Western world. Aren't you concerned at all that China, which many of us here would regard as an evil empire, would suddenly become the gainer from such a dismantling? I know you live in Hong Kong, so if he says anything nasty about China, they won't let him back in. So I'm afraid you can discount what he's going to say already. But okay. Sorry, Chandran, go ahead.
Okay. I live in Hong Kong, and firstly, I think it was great. But let's spice it up a bit of masala. How many of you here think China is evil?
I'm just doing that as a wicked thing to provoke you, but does not have benign interests towards India. There's the question.
So let me just say this, that as someone who's had very seriously the privilege of watching China over 35 years, from a very poor to where it is, I would say, just like I think most serious commentators have noted, taking a historical perspective, that India, with all the advancements of our history, never had the settler mentality to go and colonize. And broadly, I think we can say that's same of China. I would argue that China, the idea that China wants to dominate the world, I think you could argue that in people's minds it could become so economically powerful that would be a dominant force. But the idea that China wants to dominate the world, like the East India Company or the US industrial military complex, is something we need to ditch. And I think in India particularly, you need to get over this idea, because I think it's part of it is actually coming back to the Western media, which has essentially infiltrated all your talking heads, of which there are typically 10 on every screen, on every TV show that I see, all screaming at each other. So last week I was in Delhi and I spoke at 2 think tanks. And I was staggered at how archaic their view was of China. I was staggered. I met ambassadors and a few generals who thought we should not talk about Pakistan because that's a hopeless case. And I thought, my God, the next generation of Indians deserve something better than this prehistoric view. Pakistan will have a population.
I'm going to have to button on that. Why is it a prehistoric view? Our history is very recent. Chinese expansionism and aggression has happened as recently as 2020 when they broke a 44-year-old informal understanding on the disputed frontier, came in, established unilateral presence, and killed 20 of our soldiers. And you want us to say China has good intentions?
Shashi, I will not disagree.
I have to say this because
I will not disagree with you on that. My point is, you can only make peace with your enemies, and India and China need to be friends. That was my discussion. And great statesmanship and diplomacy is about that. Now, I'm of Indian origin, as you all can tell. I'm not a nationalist. I can't claim to be that. And to see India thrive is, of course, in my DNA in some ways, you can say.
Good.
But I'm not a nationalist. But I've heard both sides of the story from Indians, I've heard it from Chinese, and I've heard it from neutral diplomats as well. I will not name those. So my view is, let's assume the Indian view is the Chinese did all these bad things. But surely we need to get over that. Because these 2 countries coming together will be, in my view, the biggest benefit to the world, more so than anything else.
That is a prehistoric view, because that was the view of Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1950s.
No, what I mean...
That is the view that India held. India from the 1930s advocated closeness to China.
Let me come to why.
And it was discredited by our own experience, by Chinese misbehavior, Chinese aggression, and Chinese assault. So how can you tell us to go back to the view that taught us a very painful lesson?
In this day and age, with this fast pace of change, any views held 50 years ago is prehistoric. So what I mean is, we live in a new era. And then I'll come back, slightly shift to say, I mentioned that we live in a unique period of human history, and I will name 5. And then maybe you can put the stuff I'm saying in that context. The first one is, we live in a period of history of the most rapid exponential growth in the human population, right? The steepest part of the curve. India's population, I think at independence, is about 330 million, something like that. So India, thousands of years of civilization, has quadrupled its population in the blink of an eye. Thousands of years, in about 70 years, it's become 1.4. So just think, China's population at the time of the revolution was about 500 million. One-child policy, we can all disagree, etc. It became 1.3. If they didn't have the one-child policy, China's population today might be about 1.8, right? Again, exponential growth. And across my region, the population has quadrupled in the space of 50 years in ASEAN. So we're the steepest. This is unprecedented in human history. So the first thing we need to understand is, but we are still using growth and economic and political models that were invented by the East India Company. You know, it's democracy and all of these things. I'm just kidding, okay. It's all the old stuff. Second point I've got to make.
The problem with East India companies, they weren't democratic. We wanted our democracy.
No, but that's why we in Hong Kong wanted freedom from them, right, from the British colonial system. Anyway, second point is we live in an area of the most serious existential threat, which is climate. I think we can all agree that it's a serious problem, irrespective of how... I spent 30 years on this. I was doing climate studies before it became fashionable. And, you know, the investment banks got involved. So I think we understand that. And the scientific data on the impacts of climate in states like UP, Haryana, are pretty serious. That involves, therefore, food security and all of that at the time that the population is increasing. Third point is, of course, what I call the overreach of technology. Today, if you speak to any person, what's the most important technology going forward? They will give you some mumbo jumbo about AI and big data and the internet. I keep reminding young people, particularly, that post-COVID, they should remember that the most important technology going forward is everything that protects our health and hygiene. It's a toilet and sanitary systems and water supply. These technologies have existed, and 80% of all human waste today is not treated. 80%. So we talk about interconnectivity, and I always say connect the water systems, connect the sewers, and then we can put the fiber optics in the shit, in the sewers. Third point I'll make is the overreach of technology is the mythology of our times. That tech will somehow solve our problems. And during the COVID, I wrote a piece as India suffered that terrible period. And I wrote a piece that I thought no one would publish, but CNN published. I said the future is not digital, it's biological. And if you're interested, go and read it. But this fascination that at a click of something, these are all the hippies in Silicon Valley, a lot of Indians there now, who are telling us that a digital future, no, the future is biological. I won't go into all the details. And the last point I want to make is that we live in a world with resource constraints. Connected back to population, climate, etc., we have limited constraints. Which is the country that is most confronted but has the ability, and you've spoken about this, the ingenuity, the smart people, but the country most confronted with this problem, in my view, will be India. 1.5 million in the most crowded part of the world. So the post-Western world is how do we address this? So I leave you with this difficult dilemma. Can liberal democracies deal with the messiness that we have, given the nature of the existential threats, where, and I'll take America, not India, as the liberal democracy, though many will argue it's not. But the idea that in democracy, that the individual is king and is essentially subservient to the collective is not subservient to the collective, is nonsense. So how do we create in this era that I'm talking about with all these threats, a society where the individual is subservient to the collective, and the collective's rights essentially supersede the rights of the individual? Give an example, and then I'll shut up. You know, we see progress, economic progress and industrialization, for instance, is the automotive industry. It's a sort of the kickstarts industrialization. So what happens? You try and sell cars to everyone. So I would argue, given the cities we have, Southeast Asia, India, a car is not a human right. So when I say this in the United States, they think I'm Taliban or maybe I'm some Chinese Communist Party lackey. But car ownership is not a human right. Go to any of our cities, we need more cars like I need a hole in my head. Now, who's going to take away your right from the car? That is an issue of the individual versus the collective. And I argue that we need political systems that allow for the state to essentially put collective rights over individual rights in the world that I have just painted, which is not a political world. I painted it based on science. I come from a science background. That we don't have enough time nor the resources, and all the existential threats are converging on us. Most people talk only about climate, but it's related to food security, water, soil degradation. And my God, as of last week, they found microplastics in human brains as well. So who's going to take, and this cannot be done by the free market, nor democratic principles only as they are defined today. So you're going to have authority. And I'll finish by saying most families, I was brought up in a family, there was a lot of authority. It was called parents. And they told me what to do and what I couldn't do, and I think I came out quite well, and I behaved pretty.
No, but you were able to think for yourself and speak for yourself, which you will not be able to in a China-dominated world, and unless you actually agree with them, which by and large you seem to do. So that's the problem with that system. At least in our system, I can criticize my government, and I do all the time, and it's part of my right to do so in my democracy. even my democracy is being challenged in very many ways, and there are real questions about how freely some of our autonomous institutions are truly functioning, the truth is we can still speak our minds. No Chinese can without facing...
Can I interrupt as you interrupted me?
Sure.
Everything I've said today, I've said in China.
Yeah, but you haven't said anything the Chinese should object to.
About the Chinese system.
But there's nothing they would object to. So of course you can say...
No, sorry. About what the Chinese need to do to essentially move from where they are. But you can't take away the fact that 800 million Chinese have moved from poverty. That is freedom. That is ultimate human rights too. So I live in a multicultural society where, as you know, Malaysia is got vast amount of institutional discrimination against the non-Malays.
That's right, non-Bhumiputras.
The non-Malays. I speak about against it, but I'm careful what I say because I should not be insulting Muslims or Islam. So in China is the same. You can say what you say, but if you are not entitled, as it's supposedly the ultimate freedom in democracy, to insult every Tom, Dick, and Harry and cause disharmony. And I'm saying in large crowded nations, that should not be a right you can simply abuse. There should be constraints. And that's where the Chinese and Indian systems are slightly different. But you can say what you want in China, but you cannot cause disorder. And I'm arguing that is actually important because they are large and complex places.
Okay, on that particular point, just two things. Try saying something about Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese system, and you'll see exactly where those limits are.
I believe that's the same in India.
No, it's not true in India. My gosh, I've written a book about the Prime Minister, and so far I'm not in jail, right? So
they harass you.
No, that's not true. Secondly, the Chinese, as far as I'm concerned, their economic miracle is real, and I'm totally agreeing with you that what they've done is remarkable. I mean, we had the same size economy in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping embarked on the so-called peaceful rise. And they took their economy to 4.5 times our size. They went, for example, from 0 kilometers of 6-lane expressways in 1996 to 100,000 kilometers in 2006 in 10 years because they could just draw a line on the map and bulldoze anything in the path. There was no question of our Indian thing where you try and widen a road and there are protests, there are court cases, there are people arguing about compensation. And I must say, I prefer our system. Development is important, but human rights are also important. And the right of people to say, no, I don't want a road that's going to crush my father's graves and so on. This is something that people have the right to do in our country. And yes, you'll have Bollywood actresses coming and joining the protest. You'll have your red flags going up and God knows what other color, all of that. But as we say in India, we are like this only. And we are going to stay like this and we want to stay like this. But as an Indian, my view is we don't have to have a competition with China. I had earlier been an advocate of close relations with China precisely for economic benefits, saying, look, as long as at the end of the day, the Chinese are prospering and everyone in India has 3 square meals a day, the prospect of a decent job, a healthcare clinic within 3 kilometers walk of his place of residence, a decent school or a set of schools everywhere in the country to send their children to, and the aspiration to dream of a better life for their children. If an Indian has all that, how does it matter to an Indian that China is doing 10 times better? I don't care. I just want to ensure that all my people are well. That was my logic. But China taught me that that's not enough. And they taught us the hard way. Because when they decided that peaceful rise was done and dusted, and they started flexing their muscles, and they started imposing the so-called 9-dash line on the South China Sea, challenging the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, attacking the Japanese. When the Australians dared to criticize them, they slapped a trade embargo on Australia that practically crippled the Australian economy. And as far as India is concerned, not only do they keep violating solemn undertakings we've taken between the two countries, but they've done so for the first time in 44 years, they've done so at the cost of Indian lives. I'd be a fool as an Indian policymaker if I didn't draw the conclusion from this that China's intentions are indeed malign. I should be on my guard, that they have no desire to see us prosper and well, and I'm going to stick to that. I have friends in Southeast Asia particularly who take the same line as Chandran, who write about how India should be more friendly to China. I'm sorry, I think China has to earn it. China has been consistently unfriendly. It has also enabled the state across the border that has sent terrorists into our country and killed Indians in larger numbers, which is the biggest client state of the Chinese. There is nothing good that I can see that does not advise me to be completely on my guard against Chinese intentions, Chinese policies, Chinese ambitions. So I'm sorry, Chandran, there we'll have to part company. But I'm not saying we shouldn't be in BRICS with them to develop South-South cooperation. I'm not saying we shouldn't be in BRICS with them to develop economic growth. I'm not saying we shouldn't have alternative institutions created to complement what we get out of the World Bank and the IMF. Though you can imagine the Chinese New Development Bank will not give India a single paisa for Arunachal Pradesh because China claims our Arunachal Pradesh is their territory. So you have to understand that there are such a thing as national interests. I accept you are no longer Indian except in terms of origin, and you don't have to have the same view of national interests as I do. But I'm in India, and as an Indian, I feel very strongly that my country comes first when it comes to these issues. So BRICS is fine, but I am not going to let BRICS become a Chinese-dominated platform to promote Beijing's hegemony around the world.
Okay. I surrender to the populace. But you know when
I wasn't being popular. I'm giving very reasoned arguments, logical points, one after the other,
and
none of which you can refute. They're all true.
When the majority clap for the other person, you know you've hit a raw nerve with people. But I will just say that I'm not here to defend China. I have no vested interest in China, etc. But I have seen something that is very different. And I will just say this, and I think that should we move on.
And I should say I'm not hostile to Chandran. I've given him a blurb for his book, where I talked about the fact that Chandran Nair provides a readable and wide-ranging analysis. It's a timely work by an original thinker. And I still want him to present the book to me. But the fact is, one of the good things about original thinkers is they've also got to take as good as they give. That's why I'm giving it to him.
But I'll just say something which is kind of funny, where the tables were slightly different. The first time I was in a panel with Shashi was, I think, about 15 years ago in Tallberg.
Oh, I see. I'd forgotten that.
I think at that time you were a distinguished person working at the UN. And we were on a panel. And that's
would have been more than 15 because I've left the UN 18 years ago.
So maybe it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It was Tallberg Forum. I think Kofi Annan was there, but you and I were on a panel. Right. And there was a time of people talking about corporate CSR. And I think the CEO of Unilever was on the panel. And I said, this is all a load of nonsense. The corporates don't even care. But of course, the UN was espousing the global compact and all of that. And when I said this is all nonsense, the audience of 600 like you all clapped with me and said I was right. And then Shashi turned around to me later. I'm sure you don't remember. He said, you're a demagogue. So today he's the demagogue.
There you are. Today I'm the demagogue.
But let me just say.
After which we should open up to the audience and get their questions.
Let me just say, I've come to India a lot and I speak about this, and typically those who agree with me remain silent. That's the majority. Just saying. But then
it's a very Nixonian thing, the silent majority.
And then, but you know, when I spoke in Delhi, a UN official said the same thing to me about development. We were talking about development, and because I was saying so many things in India, and please excuse me, seem unfinished, broken. Right? Why? So then he said, you shouldn't worry because this is just a little spectrum of time in India's huge history. And I said, well, try telling that to the 600 million who have to suffer the drudgery of life, unlike those in this room. They don't care about freedom of speech. They don't care about having to say to the BJP or Congress, you guys can't do this and that. They want clean water, they want sanitation, they want housing. And I don't need to tell you, middle-class Indians, if you've been there, it's appalling. So you have to decide which political structures can deliver. I know one system that's delivered it. I won't name the country because it seems taboo. But try telling the 600 million people, keep waiting. Apparently, it's in the books. It will come sometime. That, I think, is where I'll leave it. So I'll stop there and maybe we can take some questions. Thank you.
And just before we do, the young lady wanted us to address the question of, which you partly implied, I think, that the Chinese have been made the progress they've had because of their one-party system. And is that therefore something that we should be conscious of? To which my answer is, it may work for them,
Yes.
though it does not work for all the dissidents languishing in jail. There are many hundreds of thousands who lost their lives in the Chinese Cultural Revolution and other times. And all those who disagree with the Communist Party who've now become essentially exiles. And I've met some of them in the West, including many of the Tiananmen Square rebels who became exiles in other countries. Some of whom are doing very well in exile. They're running private equity firms in Wall Street, but they started off as idealists wanting progress in China. But having said that, we also have to see what's right for us. And each country's systems are a reflection of its culture, of its history, and frankly speaking, of the temperament of its people. When I went to China a few times, I haven't been for a while now because I'm afraid my views are not going to be particularly welcome in China, but when I have been, I've talked to lots of ordinary people to the extent I could, and I found most of them were indifferent to the politics of their country. They just were interested in prospering. And in fact, if at all anything brings the Chinese down, it'll be if they fail to deliver prosperity and growth. As long as people are prospering, they don't care if the government is controlling the press, controlling the media, denying them the right to vote, stifling the dissidents. The vast majority of Chinese don't care. I don't think that's true of Indians. I think Indians, a vast majority, would care. One of the reasons why the emergency and its suspension of freedoms ended in 22 months is we couldn't sustain that system for a couple of years. And that's, thank God for it. As I said earlier, we will have our right, we have our rights to express our views, and if that makes for a slower and less efficient growth, so be it. There are countries that have grown with democracy. For example, one of the few leading democracies of Africa, Botswana, was also the country with the highest growth rate in Africa. So it is not true to imply that democracy and economic growth are incompatible, or that you have to follow the Chinese model of top-down directed growth in order to prosper. That is simply not true. There's no evidence for it. But it's also true that sometimes democracy has built-in inefficiencies. I have made the point, for example, that if a businessman wants to open a particular factory and he's willing to do it in either India or China, he goes to China and he talks to a mayor. The mayor has the authority in the Chinese system to give him the land, the electricity, the water, the road connection, find him the labor force with no rights, of course, and authorize him to manufacture and ship his goods. In India, there is no equivalent. If he goes to the mayor of a town, the mayor will say yes, yes, yes. The mayor will have to go to a municipal committee, each whose members is powerless and disagrees. Then on top of that, the mayor doesn't control the budget is controlled by the municipal commissioner. And on top of that, the state government has a view. So there are going to be a whole lot of other actors who would be involved before this businessman can get his permission. That's why he went to China and not here. And that's why when the Chinese actually started seeing capital fleeing them after COVID, we were only able to attract 10% or 15% of the capital fleeing China. All the rest of it went to countries like Chandran's Malaysia, went to Vietnam, even some to Indonesia, and we got much smaller amount than any of them. So that is partially because of our inefficiencies and not because of our democracy. We could have organized our democracy more efficiently. I, for example, introduced a private member's bill in Parliament suggesting that we have a provision for directly elected mayors who would have these authorities and would have budgetary control over what was required for the city. So you would actually have a city mayor who could solve the problems of the city and be accountable to the voters in his or her personal capacity. That's not possible because our system doesn't permit it. That's not democracy, that is inefficiency. If you have a democratically elected mayor who actually has the clout to deliver results, that's still democracy, but you can actually get the same things done that the Chinese mayor can. So I don't agree with the young lady that it's a system. I think it is the way the system is designed that gives you results. Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Would you like to give the mic to whoever asked questions?
Can I just say one thing? I would never ever suggest, and I don't think I've even alluded to the idea, that India should adopt the Chinese system. It's completely different. All my point is, try telling the 600 impoverished, disenfranchised, they have to wait another 50 years or 100 years for this democracy to work. What I'm saying is, to your point, you have to make it efficient. But to make it efficient, I would argue there needs to be a dramatic overhaul, whatever you call it. And authority is important. My argument is democratic systems, as we are seeing even in the most advanced nations in the world, have become so messy that they are not working. So I would just say today that, and this is controversial, if outcomes matter and outcomes of governance systems are supposed to liberate people, the majority, from the drudgery of life, are you ready? Then I would argue that China is more democratic than India.
In 1977, China was a communist country. In 1978, China liberalized. Now it is not a communist country or a socialist country. It is a centralized capitalism.
Agreed.
So I don't compel you to shake hands with China. At least we can copy them, because democracy and freedom, democracy, socialism, all these things spoiled our country, spoiled our state. Our youngsters are migrating to other countries. They are fed up.
So you're seconding his argument about outcome.
If Trump is emerging, democracy and socialism, Biden is responsible. If Biden is responsible, democracy is responsible for Argentina's Milei. Yes. A new dawn of capitalism is coming and emerging, and it will come all over the world. That's my opinion.
So every time, it's India who has taken the initiative for de-escalation and ready to talk at the tables. So despite that attempts by India, every time we have been awarded with a slap in the wrist. So don't you think that at least a concession in the reforms of the United Nations Security Council and an entry into the NSG would actually intend to improve the relations between India and China? Don't you think that China should take the initiative instead of India?
These are both things, the two examples you gave, the Security Council and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Both are being blocked by China. So how is it going to improve relations with China unless China changes its mind?
So that's my question. Shouldn't China take the initiative to
I see
improve
what
the
you
relations
see.
instead of India doing it again
From an
and
Indian
again and
point
again?
of view, I would welcome it, but why would China take the initiative when their intentions towards us are to cut us down to size, to keep us off balance, to encroach on our territory, to try and show the world that they're so much bigger, tougher, richer than we are? I mean, the entire thing, the problem in this entire relationship is the Chinese mentality. India has consistently tried to be friendly to the Chinese. India has actually, I mean, Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1930s and 40s wrote about how China and India were the two great Asian civilizations that were going to transform the world as an alternative to Western domination. The Chinese don't want India. The Chinese want, as far as they're concerned, India in a subordinate position. If India is willing to go crawling on bended knee, the Chinese will be happy to associate with us. Not as an equal.
Can I just say, I think you heard my distinguished friend say what the Indians, but can I just say, and you can take it as a lie or truth, but I have no reason to lie. The Chinese, I have some access, I try and help. The Chinese are so interested in having better relations. And I was just going to say to you,
on their
Shashi,
terms.
No. And I'm just going to say, Shashi, that I would love to facilitate you and a delegation of Indian politicians to come to China. Not me leading, but they are super interested. I mean, I know Shashi has a different view, but I just want everyone to know, when I'm in China, if I walk the streets in rural areas, the first thing they say is, oh, Hindu Ren. And then if I say so at a political level too, I'll let you know. Again, he may disagree, but I just thought the benefit of having this is to let others know the respect Chinese have for Indian civilization, you cannot believe. But when I come to India, all I hear is that it is bad. So there is actually goodwill at the political level. I agree something there is, but to his point, I wrote a piece last year saying that, to his point, China should lead an initiative
That's right.
to essentially, and this idea I floated with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and no one said it's a bad idea. So therein lies the lack of face-to-face diplomacy,
give you three things you can
etc.
suggest to them when you see them next. Stop insisting that Indians from Kashmir or Arunachal Pradesh cannot get Chinese visas on their Indian passports. They can only be given visas stamped on a separate piece of paper. Number two, stop putting up non-tariff barriers against Indian businesses trying to establish themselves in China. Number three, stop constantly nibbling away at the land borders, but actually make a serious effort to settle them permanently. Those are three things. And of course, number four, the two things he suggested, namely, stop objecting to India joining the nuclear suppliers group and stop objecting to India getting a permanent seat in the Security Council to show goodwill. If you can show goodwill, here are 5 ideas I've given you. If even 3 of them are adopted, India will say, okay, the Chinese are serious about peace. But frankly, you have nothing but a series of all these hostile things. And on top of that, when the Chinese don't want to directly be hostile, they pay the Pakistanis to be hostile. Come on, it's silly. But that's another conversation.
No comment.